Can you hear me at the back? All right. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I hate to correct Bashir with such a charming introduction, but it's over 50 books actually. I don't know why I even mentioned that. I mean, really, it just came to mind. Reading over this paper an hour or so ago, I was struck by how very holy it is. I seem to have declined from a riotous youth into a pious old age, which is a very cliched thing to do, though not as cliched, of course, as declining from a left-wing youth into a right-wing old age. Don't think I've done that. Not yet, anyway. So I don't know quite why I've done this, possibly fire insurance as one approaches the end, you know. Anyway. Sacrifice isn't the sexiest of subjects in these postmodern times. I mean, there are a great many more glamorous topics around than sacrifice. It smacks of masochism, of punitive self-denial, of a morbid cult of austerity, and so on. It's the kind of thing one approves of as long as it's done by somebody else, you know, like rescuing small children from buildings and so on. We all thoroughly approve of that, just hesitate to do it ourselves. And in any case, at least, I suppose, since the Romantic era, what we're supposed to do with the self is not discipline it or starve it or repress it, but realize it in some way. The ethic of self-realization has been sovereign in the modern age, though as we get towards postmodernism, we begin to wonder whether there's a self coherent and autonomous enough to be realized in any case, and the idea of self-realization falls into a certain disrepute because of that. But like all ethics, this one has its real problems. I mean, if the good life consists in realizing all your powers and capacities as fully as possible, then what about my capacity to strangle my bank manager, for example? By what criteria do we decide which powers are to be realized and which not? And this is not a question that people who advocate this kind of ethics, notably Karl Marx, I mean, Marx's ethics can be summarized, really, in this way. Good old romantic humanism. It's not a question which is normally answered. What criteria do we use? Anyway, I'll come back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, note that on this view, ethics is about what it takes to be happy. It's the science of happiness. There's also a science of unhappiness, known as psychoanalysis. And on this view, to live righteously is to live abundantly. It means to live richly, freely, prodigally, spontaneously, unstintingly, not reckoning the cost. And I think that is the ethics of the so-called New Testament. I say so-called because there's a tinge of anti-Semitism in the idea of the New Testament. But some of it is also what Aristotle means by virtue. And the idea descends from him to the greatest of theologians after Paul and Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and from there to Hegel and Marx, who are both closet Aristotelians, and from then to modern virtue ethics, people like Alistair MacIntyre and so on. So ethics on this view is about, well, what Aristotle calls well-being, or eudaimonia. It does sound rather like a lung disease. But of course, we moderns are aware of how desperately opaque to ourselves we are. One of the major marks, intellectually and emotionally, of the modern era being a recognition of our opaqueness to ourselves, not simply of the opacity of others to us, which in many ways we begin to question In some ways we can know others better than we know ourselves. But if that's the case, then it means we can't be happy simply by intuition or introspection. We can't just look into our heart and see. So we need to develop certain highly specialized, sometimes rather tedious discourses, political theory, ethics itself, and so on, to help us figure those questions out. In other words, we need to talk about it. And the only problem is that in the modern era, this conversation is likely to prove interminable because, in a word, of pluralism. I mean, almost everybody agrees that, putting white mice into microwaves is not the most morally splendid thing to do, but we can't agree on why we agree on that. And we probably never will. Which is odd, because you'd think, wouldn't you, that, well, we could agree on the fundamentals and then we diverge on particulars. No, we can't even agree on fundamentals anymore, which would have struck a certain sort of ancient or medieval mind as absolutely astonishing. Perpetual moral conflict is the price the West pays for its liberalism. Now, going back to Marx had an answer of a kind, I think, to the question of how we're to discriminate between our various powers and capacities when it comes to acting them out, when it comes to self-realization. And his answer, he doesn't say this explicitly, but I'm sort of reading in to Marx. His answer runs something like this: realize only those powers and capacities which allow others to do the same. On this reckoning, the difference between a liberal and a socialist is that the liberal believes that everyone should realize themselves in their unique fashion, but that clashes between my self-realization and yours are probably inevitable. Kind of market ethics, if you like, so that, and not only a market ethics, but a potentially tragic one as well, a potentially tragic one if you face the consequences. My choices somewhere along the line are going to conflict with yours. Yeah. Socialists believe that that kind of self-fulfillment should take a reciprocal form, or, as Marx puts it in the Communist Manifesto, the single most influential document of 19th century Europe, the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. When that happens on an interpersonal level, so that one person finds in another person the grounds and conditions of their fulfillment, and this happens mutually, yes, the technical name we give for this, which you may not be familiar with, is love. Or so a friend tells me. As an intellectual, I don't know much about things like that, but I do read the newspapers and listen to people and so on. I mean, of course, in terms of this mutual or reciprocal fulfillment, each being the ground of the other's realization, we're talking there about love in the romantic or sexual or erotic sense. We're not talking about, the love that really counts and really hurts. Love as the gospel knows it, that's to say, caritas or agape. Strikingly, the gospel has very little to say about sexuality, except that it shows Jesus as being remarkably laid back about loose women, whereas over the centuries, a lot of Christians have been unable to talk about anything else. Very strange. They mustn't have read it. The kind of love the gospel speaks of differs from sexual or erotic love in several ways. For one thing, it's ruthlessly impersonal. Love is nothing personal, whatever the modern age might think, It doesn't matter who it is you love. Not because you're supposed to love everybody. I mean, what would that feel like? The kind of feeling you get after smoking a joint or something. I love everybody. I want to embrace the whole human species. But, crucial difference, you're supposed to love any old body. Not everybody, but any old body. That's to say, anybody who has a claim on you, whatever their need is, doesn't matter about gender and ethnicity and class and all the things that cultural people get so worked up about these days. Those things don't matter, okay? Not from this point of view. They may matter from other points of view. You don't need to know the person whose place you take in the queue for the gas chambers. You don't need to know them. And you don't have to feel anything either, which is a second difference between genuine love, caritas, or agape, and, some of the more suspect forms of love we have around the place. Charity has nothing at all to do with feeling. It's a social practice, not a sentiment. I mean, you might feel utter repugnance for the beggar to whom you give a sandwich, but it doesn't matter. Probably doesn't matter as a beggar anyway. The idea that others have a claim on you because you were both in the same year at Harrow, or because you're both Bulgarian, or fellow bungee jumpers, but not because of that, but simply has a claim on you as a member of the same species, that was, of course, a revolutionary idea in its time, at which the ancien regimes reached for their weapons and reached, for their propaganda. And Christianity, of course, is one of its major sources. Quite astonishing and scandalous idea that somebody has a claim on you not because, they're the son of the Archduke of Austria, but simply because they're a human being. A universalism which postmodernism would now disastrously deny, not seeing how revolutionary that idea was in its day, not seeing it historically. So genuine love is, as far as the gospel is concerned, is anonymous, indiscriminate, impersonal, and unfeeling. Try telling that to the occupants of Love Island. Okay. It's something that some people have characterized as political love. What would love look like? How would it work? Not simply on an interpersonal level, but on the level of a whole society. Anyway, back to the free development of each, being the free development, the condition for the free development of all. That, in a word, is a communist ethics. Communism is just whatever set of institutions would allow that to happen. Not totally or ideally. I mean, Marx is deeply hostile to utopia, any form of utopia. How could a materialist not be? Yes. But sort of feasibly, to the, as far as possible, to the greatest possible extent. Think, for example, to bring it down to earth, of a self-governing cooperative, which seems to be, so as we can tell, Marx's idea of how the economy would look in a socialist society. He has, of course, famously very little to say about the look of the future because, I suppose, as a secular Jew, he knows that it's forbidden to make graven images of the future. It's always a way of trying to control it. It's always a way of trying to have it in your pocket. Yeah? But in a self-governing cooperative, the work of each member is self-realizing in some way, but in that very act augments the self-realization of others. And notice that that isn't a matter of everybody being nice and selfless and altruistic and considerate. It's actually built into the structure of the institution. Or to put the point another way, Mr. Sentence, yeah. On this model of things, however, there would seem to be no room for sacrifice. Or to put the point another way, this way of feeling or seeing doesn't seem to be able to accommodate the fact of tragedy. I don't mean by tragedy necessarily a narrative that ends badly. Not all tragedies end badly, as I'm sure you know, whether, certainly not on the stage. The first great specimen of tragic art we have, Aeschylus's Oresteia, ends on a fairly affirmative note. Oedipus, okay, has a hard time of it, but at least he loved his mother. So that in the end, he undergoes a strange kind of apotheosis in Oedipus at Colonus. Surely some god will raise him up, chant the chorus. Shakespeare's tragedies generally end with a pile of bodies littering the stage, but there's also usually some tentative, provisional movement towards new life, and that's not just a kind of cliché or wistful hope, it's actually part of the tragic action. Tragedy isn't just about endings, how things end up, any more than it's true that all's well that ends well. That's not true. Yeah? But it's about the fact that in order to have a chance of new life, you have to be hauled through hell. And even then, there's no cast iron guarantee that you will emerge, in some better place on the other side. Lear, Oedipus, Antigone, John Gabriel Borkman, whoever said, all die. In fact, if you have the ace of eternal life up your sleeve, if you die smugly assured that all will be fine, then it almost certainly won't be. I mean, if Jesus had said to himself on the cross, just, 6 hours of hanging around here, and then 3 days in the tomb, and then eternity in paradise, yeah, I'll sign up for that. Who wouldn't? Be mad not to, yes. If he had said that, then according to Christian faith, he would never have been raised from the dead. You have to live your death to the end. You have to take your death with utmost realism, which is probably impossible for interesting psychoanalytical reasons, if you're to have any chance of getting beyond it. You can't just use it as a springboard, to somewhere else. In fact, I've written a brilliant and marvelous book about death. Like all my books, really. It doesn't differ from any of the others in that respect, which isn't out yet because I really am toying with the idea of bringing it out posthumously. Right. And it would include a note saying the author wishes to reject the charge that his recent death was a publicity stunt to promote this book, but publishers don't like it. Publishers are very conservative people. They don't like this idea. Anyway, speaking of the crucifixion, I once gave a talk on BBC Radio in which I mentioned the fact that Jesus got off fairly lightly. In retrospect, this was not the wisest of things to say. For months, I was besieged by shed loads of letters from outraged conservative evangelicals promising to pray for my soul while deeply doubting that I had one in the first place. But it's true, he did get off pretty lightly. He really was only on the cross for 6 hours, as the gospel, but we don't know if that's true, but say he was. That's astonishing. Most people who were crucified thrashed around for days before they died. It was probably, if that's true, we don't know, but say it was probably the loss of blood consequent on being scourged beforehand that was his salvation there, if you thought that way. If you lose a lot of blood before you're crucified, of course, you would die a lot quicker. So maybe the scourging is historically accurate. But more importantly, crucifixion was, of course, reserved by the Romans almost entirely for political rebels. They were pinned up on the edge of the city as, pour encourager les autres, as a warning to anybody else who was thinking of trying, to overcome the greatest power in history, that, back off, don't do it. The so-called, rather euphemistically called thieves, who were crucified on either side of Jesus, were almost certainly zealots. That's to say, members of the anti-imperialist, nationalist, underground movement, a bit like first century Palestine IRA, memorably portrayed in Monty Python's Life of Brian, if you remember that, the Zealots. The Pharisees, who get a very, very bad press in the gospel, and we don't really know why Jesus has it in for the Pharisees so much, they were greatly respected, did great works and so on, but they were sort of, if you like, the theological wing of the zealots. And maybe Jesus was trying to put some daylight between himself and the zealots. He could easily have been mistaken for a zealot by slagging off, the theological wing of them, the Pharisees. On the point about being pinned out, one of the thieves, what was it? Samuel Beckett says, somebody in Beckett says, one of the thieves was saved. It's a reasonable percentage. Yes. Some of Jesus' disciples were probably zealots as well. In fact, one of them is named as a zealot. And it could be that Judas sold him out because he thought Jesus was going to be a Lenin and was bitterly disenchanted. Who knows? Some people think that Judas's surname is Iscariot, means dagger man, but some people don't. There's scholarship for you. Was Jesus himself a political revolutionary? Probably not. He believed in paying taxes to the Romans, for example, but it may have suited somebody to pretend that he was, in order to shop him to the Romans, not necessarily for discreditable reasons. If he sparked off an uprising in a Jerusalem at Passover, the Feast of Liberation, that was absolutely like a tinderbox, and his spark could have ignited it, then he might bring the whole force of the imperial power down on the heads of the Jews. So it could be that the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling caste, sold him out for that kind of reason. We don't know. They would certainly have known that Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, far from being the kind of vacillating, metaphysically minded, what is truth, Guardian reading liberal that the gospel portrays him as, was a total bastard, was a complete bastard. I mean, he would have crucified his own grandmother. He probably did, in fact, yes, almost certainly did. And in fact, Pilate was finally dismissed from the Roman service for brutality and corruption. Nobody got dismissed from the Romans. That was what you were there for, to be brutal and corrupt, So we know quite a bit about Pilate, and it's not very savoury. And the gospel has its own political reasons for whitewashing him and putting all the blame on the Jews. However, I seem to have strayed into another lecture somehow. I keep doing this. Just back to the crucifixion and the idea of tragedy. Crucifixion was, I think, a tragic event in just the sense that I was trying to outline, even though it supposedly has a good outcome on Easter Sunday. The resurrection isn't presented by the gospel writers as annulling the crucifixion, because Jesus' risen body still bears the marks of his torture. Yeah? The event was tragic in the sense that it manifested the fact that you have to be broken in order to be remade. Only through a solidarity with failure is any kind of enduring achievement possible, which is what St. John darkly calls the powers of this world, the Trumps and the Rupert Murdochs and so on, what they don't understand. Crucially, what they don't understand. Or as the poet Yeats writes, nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. And this is why the first thing that the Christian church does with a newborn human being is to drown it. Well, symbolically. Baptism is about, of course, drowning, not washing. So the tragedy there is not that everything ends in some awful catastrophe, but that genuine life can only spring from a self-dispossession so radical that it may well be beyond our powers. And that's the bad news. Yeah. And that whole situation, the fact that self-dispossession is the condition of self-fulfillment, is itself tragic. I mean, would that it wasn't. Would it be far better if the liberals and the reformists and the social democrats were right, and we could achieve the kind of justice and comradeship that we need to survive by, the odd judicious adjustment here and the odd change in the voting system there. It's these so-called realists who are, of course, always the real fantasists. There's people who pride themselves on their realism, who are the real utopianists in the bad sense of the word. The message of the gospel, as my dear friend Herbert McCabe used to say, is a very encouraging and cheering one. If you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. And this is highly inconvenient. Who wants to believe that? It's certainly far too immoderate for the English, who, if they ever get to drive on the right, will do so gradually. This wasn't what I signed up for when I grew up as a Roman Catholic. It was the smell of the incense and the plushness of the vestments that really turned me on. If I could have joined the army instead and got paid for being prepared to die. Why is a breaking a condition of remaking? Theologically, politically, and let me add, although this is a different story, psychoanalytically. Well, it wouldn't be, it doesn't have to be. One can imagine a world where it wasn't. But it's because the world is as warped and brutal as it is, because of what St. John calls the powers of this world. That's why the solution has to be a revolutionary one. Would this wasn't so? And maybe elsewhere in the universe it isn't so. But the linguistic animal is bound to be a fallen animal for reasons I can't go into here. If you approach me afterwards, privately, for a very modest fee, I might tell you, what these are. But let's just say in the meanwhile that the fall, of course, was a fall up, not a fall down. It wasn't a fall down to the beasts, to our fellow animals, they're okay. It was a fall up into language and history and consciousness and all that. Original sin has nothing to do with something that happened a long time ago with a snake and so on. It's to do with the fact that our interdependence, because of our animality and our sociality and our need to labor and produce and so on our political nature, is such that we can't move without potentially inflicting mortal damage on somebody somewhere. Novels of Thomas Hardy are all about this, I think, which isn't true of slugs. Slugs are not fallen creatures. I don't want to be odiously patronizing to slugs. I'm sure they're fine little fellows in their own way, But the fact is that they're so limited, so dreadfully limited. They can't manufacture nuclear weapons, would you believe? Unless, of course, they're doing it furtively. Maybe they do it at night, when we're not looking. But for just the same reasons, they can't create anything to rival Mendelssohn's Italian Symphony either. Felix culpa, fortunate fall, as they say. Well, am I ever going to get round to the subject of sacrifice? Yes, in a sense, that's what I've been talking about all the time. Let me just be clear, first of all, to go back to the very beginning, that properly understood, sacrifice isn't morbid and life-denying and pathological. It's not the path of those who hate life or are fearful of it. On the contrary, true sacrifice is the affirmation of life. It involves declaring something to be of great value. What is declared to be of great value? The thing that you give up. It's no sacrifice, to give up drinking bleach for Lent, for example. That's not a sacrifice. Those priests and nuns who give up sexuality because they think it's rather shameful are celibates, but they don't really practice the virtue of celibacy. You only do that if you see sexuality as something precious, but abandon it for a number of reasons. For one thing, so that you can be available to a lot more people than just to, one or two. Also because, for example, Jesus' disciples, like, say, guerrilla fighters today, weren't hampered by mortgages and prams and fire insurance policies, as far as we know. They have to give up domesticity. Almost every reference to the family in the gospel is unremittingly hostile, including to Jesus' own family. Jesus sometimes talks about his mother as no Jewish boy, no good Jewish boy, ever should. All right. So in the act of surrendering something in an odd way, you confirm its value. There's no point in surrendering something which is useless or you don't value. And again, there's an analogy here with tragedy. Tragedy is, of course, a form of mourning and lamentation, but it's also, in a strange way, and has been seen almost since ancient times, and certainly since the German idealists and romantics, as a kind of affirmation. And that's because in the act of seeing a human life torn apart, we have a renewed sense, paradoxically, of the value of that life, of why we mourn, as we wouldn't, for example, presumably, if, the protagonist was a flea. We wouldn't mourn particularly for that. We see life affirmed in the tragic protagonist's struggle against the forces which would crush them, even if this crushing is inevitable, and even if then the struggle against it becomes sort of wild and gratuitous, like Macbeth in his later days, in his last hours, becomes struggling just because, even though it will have no good end. There's a strange sense in which to fight against the inevitable is itself a manifestation of freedom. And in any case, the inevitable is usually unpleasant, and unless we fight it, we'll never know how inevitable the inevitable was in the first place. Martyrs give up their lives as the most precious thing they possess. They don't just throw them away because they feel they're intolerably painful or useless. That's a suicide. Suicides and martyrs often look alike, yes, but in that sense they're not. If Jesus is to be a martyr, then he can't want to die. I suppose that's why the gospel presents him, carefully interpolates a little scene, the Garden of Gethsemane, which shows that he's clearly panicking at the imminence of his death. Yet, of course, he has to die, not because, he's somehow fated to, but because only by an act of solidarity with the dispossessed and disregarded can he take all that on himself, like the traditional scapegoat he's portrayed as, and transform it into new life. He also has to die because we live in a world which is deeply threatened by talk of justice and which will do to death those who demand it rather than change the status quo, rather than change material interests. So crucifixion in that sense is not just some tragic catastrophe that's happened, it's simple realism. It's simple realism. If you can't see how that's how the world, the untransformed world is, then you're just the victim of some rose-tinted ideology. Faith is rooted in trying to see things how they are, per impossibile, perhaps, because only if you can see things as they are can you hope to move beyond them. But the martyr isn't just somebody who dies, but somebody who appropriates her own death, makes it her own, turns it into a performance, plucks value from the very act of being annihilated. Martyr, the word martyr, of course, means witness, and the martyr turns her body into a sign, into a way of testifying to something, whatever it is, freedom or justice, that's so precious that it actually outweighs her own existence. And because she dies for some vision or principle which is life-giving for others, and which she won't live to see or to enjoy, she makes a donation of her life to others. The martyr is he or she who donates his or her death. to others, publicizes it, places it within the public sphere, as it were, offers it as a gift to those around her. So this, I think, is really closer to what sacrifice is actually about, not about simply giving up Guinness for Lent, which is impossible anyway, because not because Guinness is a very nice drink, but by some malevolent twist of fate, St. Patrick's Day normally falls in Lent. I don't know who arranged that, what cosmic power, what malevolent or demonic force, Okay. So what we're talking about is a revolutionary transition from life to death, and from there to more abundant life. Sacrifice is the passage of the lowly or reviled thing from weakness to power, a passage which has to pass through death. And I would argue that the modern form, most important modern form of sacrifice, is political revolution, which does exactly that. The word sacrifice, of course, literally means making holy, and the holy is powerful and dangerous and not to be messed around with. The Latin word for sacred also, as you may know, means cursed, means both things, blessed and cursed, and the scapegoat or sacrificial offering is often seen as cursed and unclean. Jesus on the cross is cursed, monstrous, a hideous deformity of the human, a moral obscenity, a scandal to human sight. Yet by seeing the human at its most frightfully disfigured, you might say at its most inhuman, you also see paradoxically what's most human about it. So by taking some lowly thing and putting it through death and self-dispossession, it acquires a formidable power. Although in one sense, the lowly, in the sense of what the people that St. Paul calls the garbage of the earth, are powerful anyway, because nobody is more dangerous than those who have nothing to lose. Ruling classes have to be very careful that they don't strip people of something, of some investment in their system, some psychological or if possible material investment, because then people have nothing to lose. And if that's the case, then, and the system is oppressive, it follows, as night follows day, that they will revolt against it. But if the system can buy them off, even to a meagre extent, it is very likely that they won't revolt against it for, very realistic kinds of reasons. In the so-called Old Testament, another perhaps rather anti-Semitic term, these special people are known as the Anawim, and they have a special relationship to Yahweh because he is nothing, just as they are. The Anawim are dispossessed, they're stripped of property and well-being, they're a kind of nullity. And in a different sense, so of course is Yahweh, who is no kind of entity, he's not even a being, even with a very large capital B, certainly not a person, in the sense that, Robbie Williams is arguably a person. I mention Robbie Williams just to show you I'm not just some stuffy old intellectual, I know what's going on, don't get me wrong. Yahweh is neither inside nor outside the universe. He's impossible to speak of. He's not a moral being at all. No theologian would think God was a moral being. He's not even good and powerful and merciful and all that in anything like the sense that we use those words. So that as Thomas Aquinas knew or taught, theology which tries to speak of God is a lot of nonsense. And that, on that point, Aquinas is in total agreement with that guy whose name I always forget at Oxford, who is a famous atheist, but the only thing I remember about him is that his wife used to act in Doctor Who. Dawkins, yeah. it's finally got back to him that I say that about him, which is exactly why I've been saying it for so long. His wife did used to act in Doctor Who, actually. The only interesting thing about him, apart from being an old-fashioned 19th century rationalist. So Jesus dies his sacrificial death as a type or representative of the Anoim. You shall know who Yahweh is when you see the poor coming to power and the rich being sent empty away. Luke, with extraordinary sort of daring, if this is true, I don't know, according to some, Luke puts those words into the mouth of an obscure young Jewish woman, Mary, and some theologians think those words are part of a zealot chant. Yeah? Speaking of the rich, the most forceful argument for atheism, surely, is that if God does exist, he's hopelessly in love with Donald Trump. You know, and what other argument against religion do you need than that? You know, come on. Marx speaks of the modern equivalent of the Anoim, the masses exploited by industrial capitalism. He says in his early work, very interestingly, as a sphere, I quote, that represents the complete loss of humanity and can only redeem itself through the total redemption of humanity. Marx is using sacrificial language about social revolution. So in the end, power comes of weakness. The only authentic power is one which has a compact with weakness. Perhaps the poet of this condition par excellence is Sam Beckett. But that's different, note, from the idea that good comes out of evil. I mean, some people think that illness, afflictions of various kinds, sadness or tragedy or so on, can be life-yielding or character-building, the sort of Duke of Edinburgh syndrome, you know. Probably that's why he didn't wear a seatbelt, because being catapulted through the windscreen of a car makes a man of you, you know, will build you up morally and so on. But it's notable that nowhere in the gospel does Jesus advise or counsel the ill people, sick people, to reconcile themselves to their afflictions. Absolutely nowhere. On the contrary, he seems to regard it as the work of the devil, which was a common myth at the time. And he spends a lot of time, of course, trying to cure them. In no sense does he think that, you know, bearing one's afflictions painfully and turning them to good use, you know, is the best thing to do. Of course, if you happen to be afflicted and you can turn it to some value, then well and good. But it would be far better, of course, if you didn't have to suffer in the first place. Pain is a kind of meaninglessness, and as such has a relation to the demonic. The devils want to undo creation. They are scandalized by the very fact of being, by the very fact of created things. They want to return it to chaos, and that's their own perverted form of creativity. You know, God has preempted them by creating things, but they will in turn find a form of creativity, a negative one, by undoing all that. And they do that because they want to return everything to pure nothingness, because they find meaning and value not only deeply offensive, but unbelievably pretentious and farcical. This is Iago confronting Othello. Yeah. All that mouth-filling stuff, you know, that Othello comes out with, that gorgeous poetry, in which Iago can hear nothing but the kind of hollowness of a pompous idiot. And this is why traditionally, as in the greatest novel about hell, Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, why hell rings with the sardonic chortling and guffawing and cackling of those who think they have seen through meaning and value for the shams that they are. Simply the ridiculous ways in which puffed up little human beings try to make themselves important, whereas the devils know that nothingness is the only real thing. that exists. Whereas the traditional Christian belief is, of course, that being is good in itself. Evil is negation. It's good in the view of theologians that there are, bin liners and buffaloes and bananas and so on, and anything else beginning with B that you can think of around the place, and that these things are not to be sacrificed and certainly not to be spurned unless there's a phenomenally good reason for doing so. Though I can't, like witnessing to truth and justice, so I can't quite think how giving up bin liners might do that. When I speak of creation, by the way, but again, this is a different issue, one of the many ways in which Richard Dawkins is wrong is he thinks creation is about how the world began. Yes? Kind of pseudoscience. Doctrine of creation has nothing whatsoever to do with how the world began. Thomas Aquinas thought it perfectly reasonable to believe that the world had no beginning, as Aristotle did. In an excellent book, I'm coming to an end soon, you don't need to walk out yet. In an excellent book called Purity and Danger, the anthropologist Mary Douglas writes, I quote, that when someone freely embraces the symbols of death or death itself, a great release of power for good can be expected to follow. Freely embraces. And I think that encapsulates the meaning of sacrifice rather neatly, making it clear that it's nothing to do, with giving up Mars bars or biting your nails, whatever. And it also, I think, makes it clear that the opposition I began with between self-realization and self-repression is deeply phony, is a totally false antithesis. Nobody can gain their life except by losing it, except by way of dispossession to gain a fuller life, and that is opposed both to the naive, romantic, or humanist belief in self-expression as a good in itself, and to the punitive view that the best thing you can do with the self is to crush it, is to suppress it. Now, let me just finish by saying nobody really wants a God that you can hammer nails into, because the idea of such a God is something of an indignity. This is a God who requires absolutely nothing of his people, who needs no sacrifice in the sense of burnt offerings. All that is outmoded. As he says, as Isaiah makes him say, your burnt offerings stink in my nostrils. Well, what are you doing about the poor? What are you doing about the widows, the immigrants, and so on? A God who demands nothing except that he be allowed to love us, and who won't allow people to make images of him, graven images, because the only image of him is human beings, is flesh and blood. This non-God doesn't sound as though he has much authority about him. Yeah? I mean, we don't, if you're going to have a God, you don't really want a nice God like this. You want a big, nasty bastard of a God, with a great big stick, who will knock you around a bit, a patriarch or superego of an almighty. And why? Why do we want this? We want it because we feel guilty and we would like to be purged of our guilt. And that's what God is supposed to be. But yet, because, of course, we're also all chronic masochists, we secretly enjoy being punished and so start feeling guilty about that too. And so we need to be punished again. And then, we get a kick out of that too. And we need more knocking around. And this sterile circuit, which has a close relation to what Freud calls the death drive, is what St. Paul calls the law, which he says is cursed and in which there is no salvation. The infantile idea of God as patriarch, as big daddy, as superego is really God as Satan. Satan in Hebrew means the accuser or adversary. And that's what we really want, deep down. Satan is a false image of Yahweh, an idolatrous image of him. It grasps the fact, true enough, that God is ruthless and violent, but it doesn't see that what's ruthless and violent about him is his love, which will shatter you to pieces if you're not careful. Anybody who doubts that, read the best account of that there is, William Golding's Venture Martin. Those who can't take that love end up being annihilated by it, which is what's traditionally known as hell. The fire of hell is God himself. But that's another story. Thank you.